This is a true story about a young couple who moved into a house in a remote hollow. The house had a dark history, and the couple soon found themselves experiencing unexplained and terrifying events. The couple's names were John and Mary, and they were both in their early 20s. They had been dating for a few years, and they were finally ready to move in together. They found a small house in a remote hollow, and they fell in love with it immediately. The house was old and charming, and it had a lot of character. John and Mary moved into the house in the spring, and they were excited to start their new life together. At first, everything was perfect. They loved living in the hollow, and they enjoyed the peace and quiet. But then, strange things started happening. One night, Mary was woken up by a loud noise. She got out of bed and went to investigate, but she couldn't find anything out of place. The next morning, she told John about the noise, but he didn't believe her. A few nights later, John was woken up by a cold hand on his face. He opened his eyes and saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed. The figure disappeared as soon as John turned on the light. John and Mary started to feel scared and uneasy. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew that something was wrong. They tried to ignore the strange things that were happening, but it was getting harder and harder. One night, John and Mary were sitting in the living room watching TV. Suddenly, the TV turned off by itself. John went to turn it back on, but the remote didn't work. Then, they heard a loud crash from the kitchen. John and Mary went to investigate, and they found that a vase had been knocked off the counter and shattered on the floor. There was no one else in the kitchen, and all the doors and windows were locked. John and Mary were terrified. They didn't know what to do. They decided to call the police, but when the police arrived, they couldn't find any evidence of a break-in. The police told John and Mary that they were probably just imagining things. But John and Mary knew what they had seen and heard. They were convinced that the house was haunted. John and Mary decided to stay in the house, but they were always on edge. They were constantly afraid of what would happen next. One night, John was woken up by a loud scream. He jumped out of bed and ran to Mary's room. Mary was standing in the corner of the room, screaming in terror. John ran over to Mary and put his arms around her. He asked her what was wrong, but she couldn't speak. She was just pointing at the window. John turned to look at the window, and he saw a pale face staring back at him. The face was contorted in a mask of rage. John screamed and pulled Mary away from the window. He ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. He then went back to Mary's room, but the face was gone. John and Mary were terrified. They didn't know what to do. They decided to leave the house immediately. John and Mary packed their bags and left the house in the middle of the night. They never looked back. John and Mary never found out what was haunting the house in the hollow. But they knew that it was something evil. They were grateful to have escaped with their lives. To this day, John and Mary still have nightmares about the house in the hollow. They know that they will never forget the horrors that they experienced there.